The mail-order bride stepped off the wagon and saw him waiting, tall, silent, carved from stone and sorrow. Elias Crow. The man 7 women had already abandoned. She didn't know yet that this wilderness would test every promise she'd made, that blizzards and prejudice would try to break what they were building, or that the choice to stay would cost her everything comfortable she'd ever known. But Clara Whitmore wasn't like the others, and this time, the land was about to meet its match. If you're ready for a story about survival, loyalty, and love that refuses to break, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came down from the highland ridge like a living thing, cold and searching, pushing through every crack in the timber walls. It had been blowing for 3 days straight, and Elias Crow had stopped noticing. He stood in the doorway of his barn, one hand braced against the rough-hewn frame, watching the gray sky press down on the valley like a threat that never quite delivered. His ranch sat in a fold of land that seemed designed to punish ambition. Rocky soil, steep slopes, timber that grew twisted and stubborn. The kind of country that broke men who came to it soft and barely tolerated the ones who arrived already hard. Elias had carved this place out with his own hands over the course of 8 brutal years, and it showed in every fence post, every cleared acre, every building that stood against the weather. But the land took as much as it gave. The house behind him was solid enough, thick walls, a good roof, a stone chimney that drew smoke properly. But it was empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. He'd built it for 2 people, for a future that had lasted exactly 14 months before it ended in blood and screaming and a midwife who couldn't meet his eyes when she finally came out of the bedroom. Sarah had wanted children, had wanted a garden, had wanted laughter in these rooms. Now there was only silence. Elias pushed away from the doorframe and walked back into the barn. His hands found work automatically, checking the horses, measuring out feed, inspecting tack that didn't need inspecting. Anything to keep moving, anything to keep the stillness from settling too deep. He was a big man, built for labor, with shoulders that had widened from years of swinging an axe and wrestling fence posts into frozen ground. His face was weathered dark from sun and wind, angular and hard. With black hair he kept tied back and eyes that people found difficult to hold. He knew what he looked like, knew what people saw when they looked at him. Half Creek, half white, entirely unwelcome in most towns. He'd stopped caring about that years ago. Out here, the land didn't give a damn about bloodlines. It broke everyone the same. The first mail-order bride had arrived 2 years after Sarah died. Margaret. She'd lasted 6 days. Elias could still remember the look on her face when she'd stepped off the supply wagon. Hope struggling against fear, politeness stretched thin over disgust. She'd been young, too young, sent by an agency in St. Louis that hadn't bothered to mention certain details in their correspondence. "You didn't tell me you were—" She'd stopped herself, cheeks flushing. The advertisement said rancher. It didn't say Indian? Elias had finished for her, voice flat. I didn't expect. Margaret had pressed her lips together, looking anywhere but at him. This is very far from civilization. That was in the letter. Yes, but I thought you meant. I didn't realize it would be so. She'd gestured helplessly at the mountains, the endless sky, the isolation that pressed in from all sides. Lonely. 6 days later, she'd begged the supply wagon driver to take her back to town, and Elias had watched her leave without trying to stop her. He'd paid her travel expenses and sent her on her way with enough money to get home. No point keeping someone who didn't want to stay. The second woman, Anne, had made it 3 weeks. She'd tried. He'd give her that. She'd cleaned the house, cooked meals, organized his shelves with a determination that bordered on desperate. But the silence got to her. The wind, the emptiness that stretched for miles in every direction. "Don't you ever talk?" she'd asked one night over dinner, her voice pitched too high, too bright. "Don't you ever, I don't know, say anything?" Elias had looked up from his plate. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Anything. Something about your day or the weather or—" She'd broken off, hands twisting in her lap. I can't do this. I can't sit in silence every night like we're strangers, like I'm not even here." "You are here." "Am I?" Anne had stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. Because it feels like I'm living with a ghost, like this whole place is haunted by someone I'm never going to measure up to. She'd left the next morning. After that came Beth, who lasted 2 months before a bear got into the chicken coop, and she decided she couldn't live somewhere so dangerous. Then Louise, who missed her family. Then Catherine, who took one look at the winter supplies stacked in the cellar and realized what 6 months of snowbound isolation actually meant. Then Rachel, who'd seemed promising right up until the moment she'd asked Elias to get rid of the medicine bag that hung by the door. "It's pagan," she'd said, as if that explained everything. "It makes me uncomfortable." Elias had told her she could leave whenever she wanted. She'd left that afternoon. And finally, Dorothy, sweet practical Dorothy, who'd lasted 4 months and might have stayed longer if Elias had been capable of giving her what she needed. But he wasn't. He couldn't pretend to feel things he didn't feel, couldn't manufacture warmth he didn't possess, couldn't become someone different just because she smiled at him hopefully over breakfast. "You're a good man," she'd said on the day she left, and there'd been real sadness in her voice. "But you're not ready for this. Maybe you'll never be. And I can't wait around to find out." 7 women in 3 years, 7 failures. After Dorothy, Elias had stopped trying. He'd thrown himself back into the work, expanding the barn, clearing more land, building fences that didn't need building yet. His neighbors, the few that existed out here, had stopped asking questions. They'd learned to leave him alone. The town of Ridgemont, 15 miles down the mountain, tolerated his presence because he paid cash and didn't cause trouble. The general store owner, Marcus Webb, was civil enough. The blacksmith, Tom Brennan, did good work and kept his opinions to himself. But Elias never stayed longer than necessary, never lingered to hear the talk that started up the moment he walked away. He knew what they said, knew they called him the Indian when they thought he couldn't hear, knew they considered his ranch an oddity, a stubborn insult to the natural order of things, a half-breed building an empire and country that should have crushed him years ago. Let them talk. The land was his. Legally purchased, properly registered, defended by documents that even the most prejudiced bureaucrat couldn't dispute. He'd made something here, something that would outlast all of them, even if he had to do it alone. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the high peaks in October with a fury that caught even the old-timers by surprise. Elias spent 2 weeks preparing, cutting extra firewood, reinforcing the barn, moving the cattle to the lower pasture where they'd have some protection from the worst winds. By the time the first real storm hit, he was ready. He'd learned to be ready for everything except hope. The letter arrived on the last supply run before the pass closed for the season. Marcus Webb handed it over with a curious look that Elias ignored, shoving the envelope into his coat pocket without examining it. He loaded his supplies into the wagon, settled his bill, and headed back up the mountain before the afternoon snow started. He didn't open the letter until after dark, after he'd unloaded the wagon and fed the animals and eaten a cold dinner standing at the kitchen counter. He'd almost thrown it in the fire unopened, almost convinced himself it didn't matter. But something made him break the seal. The handwriting was clear and direct, no elaborate flourishes. Mr. Crow. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am responding to your advertisement placed with the matrimonial agency in Denver. I understand you have had difficulty finding a suitable arrangement, and I believe I know why. I have no illusions about frontier life, no expectations of comfort, and no interest in romantic notions that dissolve under hardship. I am 31 years old, widowed, without children or prospects. I can cook, clean, manage livestock, and handle a rifle. I don't mind isolation. I don't mind hard work. I don't mind silence. What I do mind is dishonesty. So I will ask you directly, are you willing to offer a partnership based on mutual respect and shared labor? If so, I will come. If you are looking for something else, affection you cannot give, or a replacement for someone you lost, then please do not respond to this letter. I have no interest in being anyone's ghost. If you decide you want a practical arrangement with a practical woman, send word. I can be ready to travel within 2 weeks. Respectfully, Clara Whitmore. Elias read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down and wrote his response. The answer came back faster than he'd expected, carried by a rider who made the dangerous trip up the pass specifically to deliver it before the weather turned completely. Clara Whitmore would arrive on the 15th of November, provided the roads remained passable. She asked only that Elias confirm he understood the terms. A working partnership, not a love match. Mutual survival, not romance. He confirmed. November 15th arrived gray and cold, with low clouds threatening snow, but not yet delivering. Elias drove the wagon down to Ridgemont in silence, his mind carefully blank, refusing to think about what he was doing or why. This was practical, sensible, nothing more. The stage was late. He waited outside the general store, ignoring the looks from townspeople who found reasons to walk past, to glance his way, to whisper behind their hands. Let them look. Let them wonder. It didn't matter. When the stage finally rattled into town, covered in mud and listing slightly to one side, only 2 passengers stepped out. An old man who immediately headed for the saloon, and a woman in a dark gray traveling dress. Clara Whitmore. She was tall, nearly as tall as some men, with broad shoulders and capable hands. Her hair was brown, streaked with early gray, pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Her face was weathered, lined at the eyes and mouth, with a directness in her gaze that most people work their whole lives to achieve. She looked like someone who'd stopped apologizing for existing a long time ago. Their eyes met across the muddy street. Elias stepped forward. Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Crow. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, steady and calm. She assessed him with the same directness she'd used in her letter, taking in his height, his build, his face, his heritage. If she felt anything about what she saw, it didn't show. The roads are worse than I expected. We should leave sooner if we want to make it before dark. No pleasantries, no small talk, just practical observation. Elias felt something unknot in his chest. Agreed. You have luggage? 1 trunk? 1 bag? She gestured to the stage driver, who was already hauling down a worn leather trunk and a smaller traveling bag. Everything I own. Elias loaded her belongings into the wagon while Clara stood nearby, watching the town watch her. She didn't fidget, didn't try to fill the silence with nervous chatter, just waited, patient and still, until he finished. Ready? He asked. Ready? They left Ridgemont behind without ceremony, the wagon wheels crunching over frozen mud as they climbed back up into the highlands. Clara sat beside him on the bench, her posture upright, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't ask questions about the town, didn't comment on the stares they'd received, didn't try to make conversation for its own sake. Miles passed. Finally, as they climbed higher and the valley opened up below them, Clara spoke. How many came before me? Elias kept his eyes on the road. 7. How long did they last? The longest was 4 months. The shortest was 6 days. Clara nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. What made them leave? Different reasons. The isolation, the work, the silence. He paused, then added quietly, Me. Were you cruel to them? No. Dishonest? No. Then it wasn't you, Clara said flatly. It was their expectations. They came looking for something you never promised to give them. Elias glanced at her, surprised. She was watching the mountains, her expression thoughtful. I meant what I wrote, she continued. I'm not here for romance. I'm not here to heal you or fix you or fill some hole left by whoever you lost. I'm here because I need a place to be, and you need someone who can do the work. That's enough. Is it? Clara turned to look at him fully, her gray eyes steady. It'll have to be. Something in her voice, some hint of old pain, old resignation, made Elias understand that Clara Whitmore had her own ghosts, her own losses, her own reasons for accepting a life this hard, this remote, this uncertain. They were both here because everywhere else had failed them. The house is basic, he said after a moment. Clean, but basic. There's a bedroom, a main room, a kitchen. I built a separate room off the side for myself. You'll have privacy. I appreciate that. The work is constant. Livestock, repairs, cooking, preservation, cleaning. Winter is the hardest. We'll be snowed in for weeks at a time, sometimes months. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away. I understand. There's a town, but it's not... Elias hesitated, searching for the right words. Friendly? Because of you? Yes. Clara absorbed this without visible reaction. Do they make trouble? No, they just don't welcome it. Then we won't give them a reason to. She shifted on the bench, settling in for the long ride. I don't need friends, Mr. Crow. I need a roof and work and a reason to get up in the morning. You can provide that. In return, I'll provide the same for you. It's a fair trade. Elias found himself almost smiling. Almost. You don't mince words. Life's too short for pretty lies. They rode in silence after that, but it was different from the silence he'd shared with the others. Dorothy had filled quiet moments with nervous chatter. Rachel had simmered with unspoken judgments. Anne had radiated discomfort like heat from a stove. Clara just existed, comfortable in her own skin, unbothered by the gaps in conversation. The ranch appeared as they crested the final ridge, buildings dark against the gray sky, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left a fire bank that morning. It looked stark and isolated and unwelcoming, the kind of place that made most people want to turn around and leave immediately. Clara studied it without speaking, her expression unreadable. That's it, Elias said, though she could obviously see that. The house is the large building, barn to the left, smokehouse, root cellar, and chicken coop beyond that. Pasture runs down to the tree line. It's well built, Clara observed. Solid. It has to be. The storms up here will tear apart anything that isn't. They descended into the valley as the first snowflakes began to fall, just a few at first, then more, dusting the ground with white. By the time Elias pulled the wagon up to the house, a light snow was coming down steadily, muffling sound and blurring the edges of everything. He helped Clara down from the wagon, then carried her trunk and bag inside while she stood in the doorway, taking in her new home with that same measuring gaze she'd given everything else. The interior was exactly as he'd described, basic but solid. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, radiating heat from the fire he'd built that morning. Rough-hewn furniture he'd made himself filled the space. A table, chairs, shelves, a bench near the door. Everything functional, nothing decorative. The bedroom door stood open, revealing a simple bed with clean linens, a washstand, a trunk for storage. The walls are thick, Clara said, running her hand along the timber. Good insulation. Winter gets cold. Had to build for it. She walked through the space slowly, examining everything. The quality of the construction, the placement of the windows, the way the chimney drew. When she reached the kitchen area, she inspected his stores: flour, salt, beans, dried meat, preserved vegetables in jars. You keep a good larder, she said approvingly. Well organized. Have to. Can't get to town for months once the heavy snow hits. Clara nodded, then turned to face him. In the firelight, her weathered face looked almost soft, though her expression remained practical. This will do fine, Mr. Crow. Better than fine. You've built something solid here. Just Elias, he heard himself say. If we're going to be working together, no point in formalities. Then call me Clara. She untied her cloak and hung it on a peg by the door, already making herself at home. Now, I assume you need to tend the animals before dark. I'll unpack and start dinner. Is there anything I should know about your preferences? Elias stared at her. Every other woman had needed a tour, explanations, reassurance. Clara was already rolling up her sleeves. I'm not particular about food, he managed. Good. Neither am I. She moved toward the kitchen area with the confidence of someone who'd learned to adapt quickly to new spaces. Go do what needs doing. I'll be here when you get back. It wasn't until Elias was halfway to the barn that he realized what was different. Every other woman had asked that question with an undertone of anxiety, of trying to please, of hoping to earn approval. Clara had asked it like a business partner checking the parameters of a job. And somehow, that made all the difference. Wook. Dinner that first night was simple. Beans, cornbread, coffee. They ate at the table in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the wind picking up outside. Clara had unpacked efficiently, her belongings stowed away, her presence already settling into the rhythms of the house. When they finished eating, she cleared the plates without asking, heating water for washing while Elias added wood to the fire and checked the shutters. They moved around each other easily, instinctively giving space, finding a natural flow to the work. "I'll take the morning shift with the livestock," Clara said as she dried the last plate. "You can show me the routine tomorrow, then we'll split the duties." "Fair?" "Fair," Elias agreed. "You know animals?" "Grew up on a farm in Missouri. Cattle, chickens, hogs. Did most of the work after my father died." She hung the dish towel to dry. "My husband wasn't much for farming. He was a clerk. Good man, but not built for that kind of labor." It was the first personal detail she'd offered. Elias found himself curious despite his better judgment. "What happened to him?" "Fever, 3 years ago." Claire's voice remained steady, matter of fact. "We'd only been married 2 years. No children. After he died, his family took the house. I wasn't legal kin, and they had no use for me, so I left." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was a long time ago." She met his eyes across the room. "What about you? Your advertisement said widowed." Elias hadn't talked about Sarah in years, hadn't said her name aloud since the last mail-order bride had left, but something about Clara's directness, her lack of pity, made it possible. "Her name was Sarah. We had 14 months together before she died in childbirth. The baby didn't make it either." Clara absorbed this with a slow nod. "That's a hard way to lose someone." "Yes." "Do you still love her?" The question should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt honest. Clara wasn't asking out of jealousy or insecurity. She was asking because she needed to understand the situation she'd walked into. "I did love her," Elias said carefully. "I still miss what we had, what we could have had. But I'm not looking for a replacement, if that's what you're worried about." "I'm not worried. Just making sure we understand each other." Clara moved toward the bedroom door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think the others left because they wanted you to be someone you're not. Someone talkative and warm and easy. But that's not who you are, and trying to force it would be exhausting for both of you." Elias felt something loosen in his chest, some tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "And you don't need me to be that?" "No, I need you to be fair, honest, and willing to split the work. Everything else is just window dressing." She smiled then, small and brief, but genuine. "Get some sleep, Elias. Tomorrow we start figuring out how this partnership works." She closed the bedroom door quietly, leaving Elias alone in the main room. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, watching shadows dance in the firelight. For the first time in 3 years, the silence in his house didn't feel empty. It felt possible. The first week passed in a blur of routine and adjustment. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch with remarkable speed, where the tools were kept, how Elias liked things organized, which animals had which temperaments. She didn't waste time or energy on unnecessary questions. If she didn't know something, she asked once, remembered the answer, and moved on. Elias found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't expected. Clara didn't require constant conversation or emotional reassurance. She worked steadily through her tasks, comfortable with silence, speaking only when there was something worth saying. They developed an easy partnership, splitting the chores, covering for each other, finding a natural division of labor that played to their respective strengths. She was stronger than she looked, capable of hauling water and chopping wood without complaint. And she was practical to her core, finding efficient solutions to problems that Elias had simply endured out of habit. "Why are you carrying water from the stream when you could build a channel?" she asked on the 4th day, after watching him make the trip 3 times. "Never thought about it." "Well, think about it now. Spring would be the time to dig it. Gravity does the work for you." She was right, and Elias found himself making mental notes for projects that had never occurred to him simply because he'd always done things a certain way. By the end of the week, Clara had reorganized the kitchen for better efficiency, repaired a broken shutter Elias had been meaning to fix for 6 months, and improved the chicken coop's ventilation. She did it all without fanfare, without asking permission, simply seeing what needed doing and doing it. "You don't wait around for instruction," Elias observed one evening over dinner. Clara looked up from her plate. "Should I?" "No, the others did. They'd ask before moving anything, before changing anything, like they were afraid to upset me." "Were they right to be afraid?" Elias considered this. No, I just wanted things to work. Then let them work. Clara returned her attention to her food. I'm not here to tiptoe around your feelings, Elias. I'm here to help run a ranch. If I see something that needs improving, I'm going to improve it. If that's a problem, tell me now. It's not a problem. Good. The snow started in earnest on the 8th day. At first it was just a steady fall, the kind they could work through with extra layers and determination. But by noon, the wind had picked up, driving the snow sideways, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Elias called them both inside earlier than usual, and they spent the afternoon securing the buildings, bringing in extra firewood, making sure the animals had enough feed to last through what was shaping up to be a serious storm. By nightfall, the blizzard was in full force. Wind screamed around the house, battering the shutters, finding every tiny gap and crack to whistle through. Snow piled against the walls, drifting high enough to cover the lower windows. The temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the inside of the glass. Elias built up the fire while Clara checked their supplies, taking inventory with the calm efficiency she brought to everything. We have enough food for 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we're careful, she reported. Water's fine as long as the well doesn't freeze. Firewood should last if we're smart about it. Could be trapped here for a while, Elias said. These storms sometimes last days. Clara nodded, unbothered. Then we'll make do. They did make do. They fell into a rhythm dictated by survival, keeping the fire fed, cooking meals, maintaining the space. But with nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, something shifted between them. Conversation happened. Not forced, not awkward, just natural. It started small. Clara mentioning something about her childhood farm. Elias responding with a memory of learning to track game from his mother's people. Clara asking a question. Elias giving an answer that led to another question. By the second day of the storm, they were talking more than they had in the entire previous week. Your mother was Creek? Clara asked, wrapped in a blanket by the fire, while Elias worked on repairing a bridle. Yes. Met my father when he was trading through her village. He was Scottish. She followed him east, but... Elias paused, considering how much to share. It didn't end well. He died when I was young. She died a few years later. That's hard, being alone that young. I had her people for a while, but I was too white for them and too Indian for the whites. Eventually, I learned it was easier to just be alone. Clara studied him with those steady, gray eyes. Is that why you came out here? To be alone? Partly. Sarah wanted adventure. Wanted to build something from nothing. This land was cheap because no one else wanted it. Seemed like the right place to disappear. Did you? Disappear? Elias met her gaze. For a while. But you can't outrun everything. No, Clara agreed softly. You can't. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, in the warm circle of firelight, something was building that neither of them had names for yet. On the 3rd night of the blizzard, Clara told him about her marriage. They'd finished dinner and were sitting by the fire, Elias in his chair, Clara on the bench, when she started talking. Not because Elias asked, but because the silence had become comfortable enough to break. Robert was a good man, she said, staring into the flames. Kind, gentle, completely unsuited for farm life. He tried, though. Tried so hard to be what I needed, but he just wasn't built for it. And I think that killed him as much as the fever did. The weight of trying to be something he wasn't. That why you put it in your letter? Elias asked quietly. About not being someone's ghost? Yes. I won't do that again. Try to force someone to be different. And I won't let someone try to force me. She turned to look at him. You are who you are, Elias. That's enough. It has to be. Same for you. Clara smiled, that small, brief smile he was learning to recognize. We're a pair, aren't we? 2 people too broken for regular society. Maybe we're not broken, Elias said. Maybe everyone else just doesn't understand that silence isn't the same as empty. Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition. Understanding. The kind of connection that doesn't need words because it exists underneath language. In the places where people are just themselves without pretense or performance. The blizzard finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached the eaves in places. The entire valley was buried under white, pristine, and unmarked except for the smoke rising from their chimney. They dug out together, working side by side to clear paths to the barn, the chicken coop, the smokehouse. It took hours of hard labor, but they moved as a team, anticipating each other's needs, covering each other's backs. When they finally stumbled back inside, exhausted and frozen, Clara made coffee while Elias rebuilt the fire. They sat together in companionable silence, too tired to talk, just existing in each other's presence. And Elias realized that something had changed. He looked forward to seeing Clara at meals, looked forward to her practical observations and dry comments, looked forward to the way she moved through his space like she belonged there. She did belong there. This wasn't romance, wasn't the desperate, hungry thing he'd felt for Sarah. But it was real. It was solid. It was a foundation they were building together, one quiet day at a time. And maybe, Elias thought as he watched Clara warm her hands around her coffee cup, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Winter settled in for the long haul after that first blizzard. More storms came, each one different, some quick and fierce, others slow and grinding. Between the storms, they worked to maintain the ranch, to keep the animals alive, to survive. Clara proved herself 100 times over. She never complained about the cold, or the isolation, or the relentless work. She just did what needed doing, day after day, with the same steady determination that had brought her here in the first place. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Elias discovered that Clara hummed while she worked, wordless tunes that filled the house with something that wasn't quite music but wasn't quite silence either. He learned that she had a sharp sense of humor, delivered so deadpan that it sometimes took him a moment to realize she was joking. He learned that she slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound, always alert for trouble. Clara learned that Elias moved differently when he thought she wasn't watching, more fluid, more connected to some part of himself he kept hidden most of the time. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, jerking awake with Sarah's name on his lips, though he never mentioned them in the morning. She learned that when he was thinking hard about something, he'd touch the medicine bag his mother had given him, fingers tracing the worn leather like a prayer. They didn't talk about these things, didn't need to. Understanding accumulated in silence. One night in late December, after a particularly brutal day of digging out from yet another storm, they sat by the fire sharing a bottle of whiskey Elias had been saving for no particular occasion. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said, her voice slightly rough from the alcohol. "Yes." "Why did you keep trying? After the first few women left, why did you keep bringing in more?" Elias turned the question over in his mind, searching for honesty. "Because I thought I was supposed to. Thought a man was supposed to have a wife, a family. Thought if I could just find the right person, maybe I could stop feeling like..." He trailed off. "Like what?" "Like I was supposed to disappear." Clara absorbed this, her expression grave in the firelight. "And now?" "Now, I don't know. You're different from them. This is different." "How?" Elias looked at her, really looked at her. At the gray in her hair and the lines on her face and the strength in her weathered hands. At the way she sat in his house like she'd always been there, comfortable in her own skin, unbothered by his silences or his past or his blood. "Because you're here," he said simply. "Not trying to be here. Not forcing yourself to stay, just here." Clara's eyes glistened slightly, though her voice remained steady. "I am here, and I'm not leaving." "Promise?" "Promise." They finished the whiskey in silence, and when Clara finally stood to go to bed, she paused by Elias's chair. For a moment he thought she might touch him, put a hand on his shoulder or his arm, make some gesture of connection. But she didn't. She just stood there, close enough that he could feel her warmth, and said quietly, "You're not supposed to disappear, Elias. You're supposed to be exactly who you are. And that's enough." Then she was gone, the bedroom door closing softly behind her. Elias sat alone by the fire for a long time, her words echoing in his head. "You're supposed to be exactly who you are." For the first time in years, he thought maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't have to be anything other than this. A man who'd built something solid in hard country, who'd survived loss and loneliness, who'd finally found someone who could stand beside him without asking him to change. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was everything. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell and the wilderness pressed in from all sides. But inside, in the warm circle of firelight, Elias Crow felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The cold deepened as January arrived, bringing with it a stillness that felt almost alive. The kind of quiet that pressed against the windows and seeped through the walls, reminding them both that the world beyond their small circle of warmth had become inhospitable to human life. But inside the ranch house, something was shifting, subtle as the turn of seasons, persistent as water wearing down stone. Clara had been there 2 months now, and the space between them had begun to feel less like distance and more like rhythm. They moved through their days with an efficiency born of mutual respect. Morning chores were divided without discussion. Elias handled the heavier livestock work while Clara managed the chickens and the kitchen. Afternoons, they worked together on whatever repairs or preparations needed doing. Evenings, they shared meals and firelight, sometimes talking, sometimes not, both comfortable either way. But Elias had started to notice things, small things. The way Clara's face softened when she looked out at the snow-covered valley in the early morning light. The way she'd pause sometimes while working, her expression distant, as if listening to something only she could hear. The way she never asked for help but accepted it gracefully when offered. And he'd started to notice his own reactions to her presence. The way his chest loosened when he heard her moving around the kitchen in the morning. The way he found himself lingering over dinner, reluctant to end the day's brief moments of connection. The way her rare smiles had become something he looked forward to more than he wanted to admit. This wasn't what he'd expected, wasn't what either of them had signed up for. But it was happening anyway. One morning in mid-January, Elias woke to an unusual sound, or rather, an unusual absence of sound. The wind had stopped, completely. After weeks of constant howling, the silence felt unnatural, almost ominous. He dressed quickly and went to the main room, expecting to find Clara already up and working. Instead, she stood at the window, still in her nightdress and robe, staring out at the world beyond. "Something's wrong," she said without turning around. Elias joined her at the window. The sky had turned a strange yellowish gray, and the air felt heavy, expectant. The animals were restless. He could hear the horses moving nervously in the barn, the chickens making anxious sounds. "Big storm coming," he said, "bigger than the others." Clara nodded slowly. "How long do we have?" "Few hours, maybe less." He was already mentally running through their preparations. "We need to bring everything inside that we might need. Food, water, extra wood. Once this hits, we won't be able to get to the outbuildings." They worked with urgent efficiency, making trip after trip between the house and the other buildings. Clara hauled buckets of water while Elias stacked firewood. They moved the chickens into a protected corner of the barn and double-checked the horses' feed supply. Every shutter was secured, every gap was sealed, every potential weakness was reinforced. By noon, the first snowflakes were falling, large and heavy, dropping straight down in the windless air. "Inside," Elias ordered. "Now." They barely made it. The storm hit like a physical force, wind roaring to life with a vengeance that shook the entire house. Snow came down so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet. The temperature plummeted so fast that frost formed instantly on every surface. This wasn't like the other storms. This was something else entirely. The kind of weather that killed people who weren't prepared, that buried entire homesteads and didn't release them until spring. Elias built the fire up as high as he dared while Clara organized their emergency supplies. They had enough food for 2 weeks, maybe 3. Water for 10 days if they were careful. Wood for a month if they rationed it properly. "We'll be fine," Clara said, more statement than reassurance. "We've prepared for this." But as the hours wore on and the storm only intensified, Elias felt a familiar dread settling into his bones. He'd seen storms like this before, had lost neighbors to them, had found their frozen bodies weeks later when the snow finally melted. Sarah had been afraid of storms like this, had huddled by the fire with her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound of the wind. It had driven her nearly mad that first winter, the relentless howling, the sense of being trapped in a prison made of ice and darkness. But Clara didn't huddle, didn't flinch. She moved through the house with calm purpose, checking their supplies, maintaining the fire, cooking meals as if this were just another day. You're not afraid, Elias observed that first night, watching her work by lamplight. Clara paused, considering the question. I'm cautious, but fear doesn't help anything. Either we're prepared or we're not. Either the house holds or it doesn't. Worrying won't change the outcome. That's very practical. It's very necessary. She sat down across from him, her face serious in the flickering light. I learned a long time ago that panic kills faster than cold does. You stay calm, you think clearly, you survive. It's that simple. Nothing's that simple. No, Clara agreed, but pretending it is helps you get through it. The storm raged for 3 days without pause. 3 days of howling wind and driving snow and cold so intense it felt like the world itself might shatter. The house groaned and creaked under the assault, snow piling so high against the walls that the windows on one side were completely buried. They were trapped, completely, utterly trapped. And in that enforced intimacy, with nothing to do but survive and nowhere to go but deeper into each other's company, the careful distance they'd maintained began to dissolve. It started with stories. Clara talked about growing up on her family's farm, about a childhood spent in endless work, but also in the kind of freedom that came from open spaces and minimal supervision. She talked about her father, a hard man, but a fair one, who taught her everything he knew about the land before consumption took him when she was 16. Elias found himself sharing things he hadn't spoken about in years. His mother's people, the Creek traditions she'd tried to pass on to him even as the white world pulled him away. The medicine she'd taught him, the stories she'd told, the way she'd seen the world as alive and interconnected in ways that most people never understood. Do you still practice it? Clara asked. The medicine? Some. Small things, herbs mostly, ways of reading the weather, the animals. He touched the medicine bag at his throat. I keep this. It's all I have left of her. What's in it? Sacred things. Tobacco. Cedar. A stone from the creek where I was born. A piece of bone from the first deer I ever killed. He'd never told anyone this, not even Sarah. She made it for me before she died, said it would keep me connected to who I was, no matter how far I traveled. Clara reached out slowly, telegraphing her intent, and gently touched the worn leather. It's beautiful. Her fingers were warm against his chest, and Elias felt something shift inside him, some wall he'd built crumbling just slightly. The others hated it, he heard himself say. The women who came before, most of them anyway. Rachel wanted me to get rid of it, said it was ungodly. Rachel was a fool. Clara's voice was sharp, protective. This is part of you. Anyone who asks you to cut away pieces of yourself doesn't deserve to be here. Elias met her eyes and saw something there that made his breath catch. Not pity, not curiosity, just acceptance, complete and unwavering. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For seeing me. Clara's hand lingered a moment longer, then withdrew. I've always seen you, Elias, from the moment I stepped off that stage. The second night of the storm, the temperature inside the house dropped dangerously low despite the fire. Elias woke to find frost forming on the inside walls, their breath visible even near the hearth. He built up the fire immediately, but it was clear they had a problem. We need to conserve heat, he said, wrapping another blanket around Clara's shoulders. Stay close to the fire. Don't move around more than necessary. Clara nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. But even with every blanket they owned piled on, even with the fire roaring, the cold was relentless. It crept in through invisible cracks, settled into corners, turned the far edges of the room into frozen zones they couldn't safely occupy. By midnight, Clara was shivering despite her layers. This isn't working, Elias said. You need to move closer to the fire. I'm as close as I can get. No, you need... He stopped, aware of what he was about to suggest and all the implications that came with it. Body heat. We need to share body heat. Clara looked at him steadily. What are you proposing? Sleeping near the fire, together, not... He fumbled for words, feeling heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the flames. Not like that. Just close enough to keep each other warm. It's survival, nothing more. I know that, Clara said simply. I'm not scandalized, Elias. I'm freezing. If sharing warmth keeps us alive, then that's what we do. They arranged their blankets near the hearth, creating a nest of fabric and furs close enough to the fire to benefit from its heat, but far enough to be safe. Elias lay down first, giving Clara the spot closer to the flames. She settled beside him, her back to his chest, and he carefully draped the remaining blankets over both of them. The intimacy was immediate and overwhelming. He could feel every breath she took, every slight movement of her body, could smell her hair, plain soap and wood smoke, could hear her heartbeat gradually slowing as the warmth surrounded them. "Is this all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes," Clara whispered. "Don't worry, I trust you." Those words settled into Elias's chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he knew about himself. She trusted him. This woman who'd been hurt and abandoned, who'd learned to expect nothing from the world, trusted him with her safety, her warmth, her vulnerability. He would die before betraying that trust. They lay together in silence, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle beside them. Gradually, Clara's shivering stopped. Her breathing deepened, steadied. She relaxed against him, her body fitting against his like they'd been carved from the same stone. And Elias, who hadn't touched another human being in years, who'd convinced himself he was better off alone, felt something break open inside him. Not the hungry, desperate love he'd felt for Sarah. Something different. Something quieter, but no less powerful. Respect, partnership. The beginning of something that might, if given time and care, become everything. He didn't sleep that night. Just lay there, feeling Clara breathe, keeping watch over her rest like a guardian standing vigil. And when morning came gray and cold through the buried windows, when she stirred and woke and turned to look at him with sleep-soft eyes, he saw his own feelings reflected back at him. She felt it too. This shift, this change. Neither of them spoke about it. They simply rose, tended the fire, made breakfast, and went about the business of survival. But something had fundamentally altered between them, and there was no going back to what they'd been before. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind devastation. Snow had drifted so high that the barn roof was barely visible. One of the outbuilding's walls had collapsed under the weight. The entire world was buried under white, silent and still and deadly. "We need to dig out," Elias said, staring at the landscape through the one window that hadn't been completely covered. "Check on the animals. Make sure nothing else collapsed." "I'll help," Clara said immediately. "No, it's too dangerous. If the snow shifts, then you'll need someone to dig you out." Her voice was firm, brooking no argument. "We're partners, Elias. That means we face danger together." He wanted to protest, wanted to keep her safe inside where nothing could hurt her. But he could see in her eyes that this mattered, that being protected wasn't what she needed. She needed to be trusted, to be treated as an equal, to stand beside him in the work regardless of the risk. So he nodded. "Stay close. Watch where you step. If I say run, you run." "Same to you." They dug for hours, carving tunnels through snow that came up to their chests in places. It was brutal, exhausting work. Elias's muscles screamed and his lungs burned from the cold air. Beside him, Clara worked with grim determination, her face red with effort, but her movements steady and strong. When they finally reached the barn, they found the horses frightened but unharmed, the chickens huddled together for warmth. The collapsed outbuilding was a loss, but nothing they couldn't rebuild come spring. "We made it," Clara said, leaning against the barn wall, breathing hard. "We actually made it." Elias looked at her, cheeks flushed, hair escaping from her braid, eyes bright with the kind of triumph that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. And he felt something surge in his chest, powerful and undeniable. Pride. In her. In them. In what they'd built together. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did." That night, as they sat by the fire recovering from the day's brutal labor, Clara broke the comfortable silence. "Elias, can I ask you something?" "Always." "What do you want from this?" She gestured between them. "From us. I know we said partnership, practical arrangement, but things have changed. We both know it. So I need to know, what do you want?" Elias had been asking himself the same question for weeks. He'd thought he knew the answer when he'd sent for her. Thought he wanted exactly what she'd offered in her letter. Mutual survival, shared labor, nothing more. But somewhere between that first wagon ride and sleeping beside her near the fire, between watching her work and hearing her stories and learning the shape of her silences, his wants had changed. I want... He struggled to find words for feelings he barely understood himself. I want you to stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where you want to be. I want to wake up knowing you'll be there. I want to build something with you that lasts. Not just survival, something more than that. What kind of more? I don't know yet, but I want to find out. He met her eyes, letting her see his uncertainty and his hope. Is that enough? Is that fair to you? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but soft. When I came here, I told myself I didn't need affection, didn't need warmth, just needed work and purpose and a roof over my head. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I was lying to you and to myself. I do need those things. I do want them. I just didn't think I deserved to ask for them. You deserve everything, Elias said fiercely. So do you. Clara reached out and took his hand, the first time she deliberately touched him when survival didn't demand it. So maybe we stop pretending we're just partners. Maybe we admit that this is becoming something else. Something neither of us planned for, but both of us want. What are we calling it? I don't know, but it's real. And it's ours. Her fingers tightened around his. I'm not afraid of it, Elias. Are you? He thought about Sarah, about the guilt he'd carried for so long, about the voice in his head that said he didn't deserve a second chance at anything good. Then he looked at Clara, solid and real and here, choosing him not out of desperation but out of genuine desire, and felt that guilt begin to loosen its hold. No, he said, I'm not afraid. They sat together by the fire, hands joined, not speaking but communicating in the wordless language they'd developed over months of shared silence. And when Clara finally stood to go to bed, she paused at the bedroom door. Elias? Yeah? Thank you for seeing me too. Then she was gone, and Elias sat alone with his thoughts and the crackling fire, and the knowledge that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The weeks that followed were different. Not dramatically. They still worked the same rhythms, still moved through their days with the same practical efficiency. But there was a new awareness between them, a charge in the air that made every casual touch feel significant, every shared glance feel weighted with meaning. They started sitting closer at meals, started lingering in conversation longer, started finding excuses to work together when they could have easily worked apart, and slowly, carefully, they began building something that went beyond partnership into territory neither of them had maps for. One evening in early February, as they prepared dinner together, Clara spoke without looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. I got a letter from my sister before I left Missouri. Elias glanced at her, surprised. She'd never mentioned family before. You have a sister? 2. One older, one younger. The older one, Margaret, wrote to tell me not to come here. Said I was being foolish. Said no man advertises for a wife unless he's desperate or dangerous or both. She might have been right. She wasn't. Clara set down her knife and turned to face him fully. She was afraid. Afraid I'd end up hurt or alone or worse. But what she didn't understand is that I was already alone, already hurt. This was a chance at something different, even if it was risky. Do you regret it? Taking the risk? No. The answer came without hesitation. I found something here I didn't know I was looking for. Something worth keeping. The ranch? Clara smiled. That small, knowing smile that made Elias's chest tighten. You know that's not what I mean. Before he could respond, she'd returned to her chopping, leaving him to process the implications of what she'd just admitted. She valued him, valued this. Not just as survival, not just as convenience, but as something worth risking everything for. The feeling was entirely mutual. February wore on, bringing more snow, but nothing as devastating as that first massive storm. They fell into an easy domesticity that felt both strange and natural. Clara began making small improvements to the house: curtains for the windows, a braided rug by the fire, herbs drying from the rafters. Not erasing Sarah's presence, but layering her own over it, creating something new from what had been. Elias found himself watching her more than he probably should, noticing the way lamplight caught in her hair, the way her hands moved with such capable grace, the way she hummed those wordless tunes while she worked, filling the silence with something that wasn't quite music, but felt like contentment. One night she caught him staring. "What?" she asked, amusement coloring her voice. "Nothing, just thinking." "About?" "About how different this is. How different you are." Clara set down her mending and gave him her full attention. "Different from what you expected?" "Different from everything." Elias struggled to articulate thoughts he'd been circling for weeks. "The others, they tried to make this place into something it's not. Tried to make me into someone I'm not. But you fit. Like you were always supposed to be here." "Maybe I was." Clara's expression grew serious. "I don't believe in fate or destiny or any of that, but I do believe that sometimes people find each other at exactly the right time. When they're both ready. When they both need what the other can offer." "What do you need from me, Clara?" She thought about this for a long moment before answering. "Honesty. Respect. A place to belong. And maybe, She paused, vulnerability flickering across her weathered face. "Maybe someone who sees me as more than just useful. Someone who values me for more than what I can do." "I do," Elias said immediately. "I value everything about you. The work, yes, but also the way you think, the way you face things head on, the way you don't need me to be anything other than what I am. You're not just useful, Clara. You're—" He stopped, suddenly aware that he was about to say something that would change everything. "I'm what?" Clara prompted gently. Elias took a breath, jumped. "You're becoming essential." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clara's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Elias thought he'd overstepped, thought he'd ruined the careful balance they'd achieved. Then she smiled, not the small, brief smile he'd grown accustomed to, but something wider, warmer, more open than he'd ever seen from her. "Good," she said softly, "because you're becoming essential to me too." They didn't move closer, didn't touch. The moment didn't need physical expression to be profound. It was enough to have spoken the truth aloud, to have acknowledged what was building between them, to have given it space to exist and grow. That night, Elias lay in his bed in the side room and listened to Clara moving around the main house, banking the fire and preparing for sleep. And he thought about Sarah, about the love they'd shared and the life they'd started to build before it was torn away. He would always miss her, would always carry the shape of that loss. But Clara wasn't asking him to forget Sarah or replace her. She was simply offering to walk forward beside him into whatever came next. And maybe that was the greatest gift anyone could offer. Not the erasure of the past, but the promise of a future built on honest ground. By the time March arrived, bringing the first hints of spring, Elias had made a decision. He didn't announce it, didn't make a grand declaration. He simply started preparing. In his workshop, during the hours when Clara was occupied with other tasks, he began working on a project, carving, shaping, smoothing wood with patient hands until it became something beautiful. He was making her a chair, not just any chair, a rocking chair built to her proportions, with armrests carved with subtle patterns that echoed the traditional Creek designs his mother had taught him. Something that was his and hers at the same time. Something that said, "You belong here, in this house, in this life, with me." It took him 2 weeks of careful work. When it was finally finished, he carried it into the house and set it by the fire. Clara came in from feeding the chickens and stopped dead when she saw it. "Elias," she breathed, "what is this?" "Yours, if you want it." She approached the chair slowly, running her hands over the smooth wood, tracing the carved patterns with wondering fingers. "You made this? For me?" "Yes. It's beautiful, these designs. They're Creek. From my mother's people, they mean..." He hesitated, then committed. They mean home, belonging, family. Clara looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes, the first he'd ever seen her shed. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep it. Say you'll stay. I already told you I'd stay. I know, but I needed you to know that I want you to. That this isn't just convenience or survival anymore. Elias moved closer, close enough to see the emotions playing across her weathered face. You're not a mail-order bride, Clara. You're not a housekeeper or a partner or any other word that makes this sound temporary. You're… What? She whispered. What am I? And Elias, who had spent years building walls around his heart, who had convinced himself he would never feel this way again, said the truth. Mine, if you want to be, and I'm yours if you'll have me. Clara made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and closed the distance between them. For a moment they just stood there, close enough to touch but not quite touching, letting the weight of what had just been said settle around them. Then Clara reached up and cupped Elias's face with both hands, her calloused palms warm against his skin. I want to be, she said clearly, and I'll have you, all of you, for as long as we both live. When they kissed, it was nothing like the desperate passion Elias remembered from his youth. It was slow and sure and steady, like everything else about what they'd built together. A promise made with lips and breath, and the quiet certainty of two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and decided to stay. They stood together by the fire as the March wind howled outside, two people who'd been broken by life finding wholeness in each other. And for the first time since Sarah died, Elias allowed himself to believe that the future might hold something other than endless, solitary survival. It might hold love, real, complicated, hard-won love. And maybe that was worth risking everything for. Spring came slowly to the highlands, reluctant and hard-won. The snow began to retreat in patches, revealing brown grass and muddy earth. Ice broke apart in the streams with sounds like gunfire. Birds returned, their calls strange and welcome after months of wind silence. And with the thaw came the knowledge that isolation was ending, that the world beyond their small valley would soon demand their attention again. Clara stood at the window one morning in late March, watching water drip from the eaves, her hand resting unconsciously on the carved armrest of her rocking chair. Elias came up behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. We need supplies, he said quietly. Seed for planting, tools that need replacing, medicine, things we can't make ourselves. Ridgemont? Yes. He hesitated, and Clara could feel the tension in that pause. It'll be different this time. You'll be with me. People will talk. Clara turned to face him, reading the concern in his dark eyes. In the months since that first kiss, they'd grown comfortable with physical closeness, touching easily, sleeping side by side when the cold demanded it, existing in each other's space with natural intimacy. But this was different. This was taking what they'd built in private and exposing it to the harsh light of public judgment. Let them talk, she said firmly. I'm not ashamed of you, Elias, and I won't pretend to be. It's not about shame. It's about safety. Some people in that town… He trailed off, jaw tight. They tolerate me because I keep to myself, but if they think I've trapped some white woman, convinced her to… Trapped? Claire's voice sharpened. Is that what they'll say? That you forced me somehow? They'll say worse than that. Clara felt anger kindle in her chest, hot and fierce. She'd known prejudice existed, had seen it directed at others, had heard the ugly words people used when they thought themselves safe from consequence. But knowing it existed was different from imagining it aimed at someone she loved. And she did love him. Had probably loved him since that night by the fire when he'd admitted he wasn't afraid anymore. The realization had crept up on her slowly, undeniable as spring, and now it lived in her bones like certainty. Then we'll show them they're wrong, she said. We'll go to town together. We'll conduct our business with dignity, and if anyone has something to say about it, they can say it to my face. Elias searched her expression, looking for doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. They prepared for the trip with careful thoroughness. Elias hitched the wagon while Clara made a list of everything they needed. They dressed in their best clothes, Elias in a clean shirt and his only jacket, Clara in the dark blue dress she'd been saving, her hair braided and pinned neatly. They looked like what they were, hard-working people heading to town for supplies, nothing more and nothing less. But Clara knew it wouldn't matter how respectable they appeared. Some people would see only what they wanted to see. The ride down to Ridgemont took most of the morning. The road was muddy from snowmelt, rutted and treacherous in places, requiring Elias's full attention to navigate. Clara sat beside him, watching the landscape change as they descended, the harsh alpine terrain giving way to gentler slopes, then to the valley where the town crouched against the river. Ridgemont was small, maybe 200 people when everyone was home. A single main street lined with buildings, the general store, the blacksmith, a boarding house, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other establishments that served the scattered ranches and homesteads in the surrounding area. It wasn't much, but it was civilization, and Clara felt herself straightening instinctively as they entered town. People noticed them immediately. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. A woman herding children across the street pulled them closer, as if Elias and Clara posed some kind of threat. Two men standing outside the saloon stared openly, their expressions hardening. "Easy," Elias murmured, though Clara wasn't sure if he was talking to her or himself. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, and for a moment neither of them moved. Clara could feel the weight of watching eyes, the pressure of judgment settling over them like a physical thing. Then she stood, smoothed her skirts, and stepped down from the wagon with her head high. Elias came around to her side, and without thinking about it, Clara took his arm. Not clinging, not performing, just standing beside him as an equal partner. His muscles tensed under her hand, but he didn't pull away. Together they walked into Marcus Webb's general store. The interior was dim after the bright spring sunshine, smelling of flour and tobacco and coffee. Marcus stood behind the counter, a thin man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a calculating expression. His gaze flicked from Elias to Clara and back again, and something complicated passed across his face. "Crow," he said neutrally. "Wasn't expecting you down until next month. Need supplies earlier this year, planning on expanding the garden." Elias's voice was even, carefully polite. "This is Clara, my wife." The word hung in the air. Wife. Not housekeeper, not hired help, not some temporary arrangement. Wife. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's so. Didn't realize you'd gotten married." "Winter wedding," Clara said smoothly, her voice pleasant but firm. "Small ceremony, just the two of us. We would have invited people, but the roads were impassable." It was a lie, of course. They hadn't had any ceremony at all. But Clara understood instinctively that the fiction was necessary, that admitting to a simple partnership would only fuel the ugly talk. Marcus absorbed this, his expression unreadable. "Well, congratulations, I suppose. What can I get for you?" They went through their list methodically. Seed packets, salt, sugar, lamp oil, ammunition, bolts of fabric for Clara to sew into new clothes. Marcus filled the order without comment, but Clara could feel his curiosity like a living thing, could see the questions he wanted to ask, but didn't quite dare. They were loading their purchases into the wagon when trouble arrived. 3 men approached from the direction of the saloon, moving with the loose-limbed confidence of people who'd been drinking. Clara recognized the type immediately, men who found their courage in bottles and their power in numbers. "Well, well," the leader said, a stocky man with a red face and mean eyes. "Crow's got himself a woman. Didn't think any white girl would be desperate enough." Elias went very still, his hand tightening on the sack of flour he was holding. "We're not looking for trouble, Harris, just getting supplies." "I bet you are. Supplies for what? Playing house with this poor creature you've convinced to shack up with you?" Harris looked Clara up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "What's the matter, sweetheart? Couldn't find a real man?" The other 2 laughed, encouraged by Harris's boldness. Clara felt Elias tense beside her, saw his jaw clench, and his hands curl into fists. He was about to do something, say something, or maybe throw a punch, and Clara knew with absolute certainty that if he did, these men would use it as an excuse for violence. So she stepped forward, placing herself slightly between Elias and Harris, her expression calm and her voice clear. "My husband is more of a man than you'll ever be, Mr. Harris. He built a ranch from nothing in country that would have killed you inside a month. He survived winters that would have broken your spirit and your body. He works harder in a single day than you probably work in a week. She paused, letting her words sink in. So I suggest you take your opinions and your liquor breath and go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. We have no interest in entertaining fools. The silence that followed was absolute. Harris's face went from red to purple, his mouth working soundlessly. The men flanking him looked uncertain now, glancing at each other as if trying to decide whether this small, weathered woman had just insulted them badly enough to warrant retaliation. "You don't know what you're talking about," Harris finally managed. "You don't know what he is. I know exactly what he is. He's my husband. He's a better man than you. And if you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me." Clara didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. There was steel in her words, cold and unyielding, and something in her expression must have conveyed that she meant every syllable. Harris took a step back, his bravado crumbling. "You're going to regret this, both of you. This town doesn't own us," Clara interrupted, "and your approval means less than nothing to me. Now, are you going to let us finish loading our wagon, or do I need to find the sheriff and report you for harassment?" The threat was mostly empty. Clara had no idea if Ridgemont even had a functioning sheriff, but it had the desired effect. Harris muttered something under his breath and stalked away, his companions trailing after him like dogs dismissed by their master. Only when they were gone did Clara allow herself to breathe, to feel the trembling in her hands and the racing of her heart. She'd just stood up to 3 drunk men in the middle of a hostile town, and she had no idea if she'd made things better or worse. Elias touched her elbow gently. "Clara, don't." She turned to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made him stop. "Don't tell me I shouldn't have done that. Don't tell me it was dangerous or foolish or that I should have let you handle it." "I wasn't going to say any of that." "Then what were you going to say?" Elias looked at her with an expression so intense it made her breath catch. "I was going to say thank you. No one has ever—" He stopped, struggling with words. "No one has ever defended me like that, stood up for me like I was worth defending." Clara's anger melted into something softer, more tender. She reached up and touched his face, aware that they were still in public, that people were still watching but not caring anymore. "You are worth defending. You're worth everything." She said it loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, making it a declaration. "And I'll stand beside you against anyone who says different." They finished loading the wagon in silence, but it was a charged silence now, full of unspoken emotion. Clara could feel eyes on them from every direction, some curious, some hostile, some impossible to read. Let them look. Let them judge. It didn't change what she and Elias had built together. As they climbed back onto the wagon, Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway of his store. He stood there for a moment, watching them, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Crow," he called out. Clara turned, surprised. "Your husband's always paid his bills on time, always been fair in his dealings. That counts for something." Marcus nodded once, almost respectfully. "You're welcome in my store any time." It was a small thing, a tiny gesture of acceptance. But in that moment, in that hostile town, it felt like victory. "Thank you, Mr. Webb," Clara said. "We appreciate that." They left Ridgemont behind with the sun high overhead, the wagon heavy with supplies. Neither of them spoke for the first mile, both processing what had just happened. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "That was dangerous. Harris and his friends, they're mean drunks. They could have hurt you." "They could have tried," Clara's voice was calm. "But they didn't, because bullies are cowards at heart. They need their victims to be afraid. I wasn't afraid. You should have been. Maybe. But fear wouldn't have helped us." She shifted on the bench to face him more fully. "Elias, I need you to understand something. I didn't defend you because I think you can't defend yourself. I know you can. But if you'd confronted them, it would have confirmed everything they already believe about you. They would have called you violent, dangerous, everything they want to believe about." "About Indians?" Elias finished flatly. "Yes. About people they've decided aren't fully human, people they can hurt without consequences." Clara's jaw tightened. But when I confronted them, it became something different. It became a white woman choosing you, publicly claiming you, refusing to accept their narrative. That's what scared Harris, not violence, the fact that I wouldn't play along with his prejudice. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the reins. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I've spent my whole life trying to make myself small, trying not to be noticed, not to cause trouble, not to give anyone an excuse to... He stopped, swallowed hard. Sarah loved me, but she was always afraid. Afraid of what people would say, what they would do. She asked me to hide parts of myself, to not speak my mother's language, not to wear traditional clothes, not to do anything that would draw attention to what I was. And you did it? For her? I tried. It made her feel safer. His expression was bleak. But you can't hide what you are. People see what they want to see. And eventually Sarah realized that being with me would always mean being afraid. Clara felt her heart break a little, imagining a younger Elias trying desperately to be acceptable, to be safe, to be loved despite the world's cruelty. I'm not Sarah. No, you're not. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. You're braver than anyone I've ever met, and I don't deserve you. That's not your decision to make. I chose you. I keep choosing you, and I'll keep choosing you for as long as we both live. Clara reached over and took his hand. You don't have to make yourself small anymore, Elias. Not for me. Not for anyone. I want all of you. Every part you've had to hide. Every piece of yourself you've been told to be ashamed of. I want it all. Elias's fingers tightened around hers, his throat working with emotion. What if it's too much? What if people make it impossible for us to... Then we'll deal with it. Deal with... together. Clara's voice was fierce now. I didn't come to your ranch to live in fear. I came to build something, and no one, not Harris, not anyone else in that town, is going to take that away from us. They rode in silence after that, hands joined, the wagon creaking beneath them, and the mountains rising on either side. And as Ridgemont disappeared behind them and the ranch came into view ahead, Clara felt something settle in her chest. A certainty. A commitment deeper than any legal marriage could create. She had found where she belonged, and she would defend it with everything she had. The confrontation in Ridgemont changed something between them. That night, as they unloaded supplies and put everything away, there was a new ease in how they moved around each other. A new openness in their conversations. Over dinner, Elias told her stories he'd never shared before. About his mother teaching him to read the stars, to find medicine in plants, to understand the language of animals. About the years he'd spent trying to belong to both worlds and ending up belonging to neither. About the loneliness that had become so familiar he'd stopped recognizing it as pain. Clara listened without interrupting, understanding that these were gifts he was giving her. Pieces of himself he'd kept hidden for so long that speaking them aloud was almost painful. When he finished, she shared her own stories, about a marriage that had been kind but passionless, built on companionship rather than desire. About the way Robert had looked at her sometimes, with love, but also with a kind of bewilderment, as if he couldn't quite understand the woman he'd married. About the relief she'd felt when he died, and the guilt that had followed that relief. I cared for him, she said quietly, but I never loved him the way I should have. And I think he knew. I think we both knew we were settling for something less than what we deserved. And now? Elias asked. Now I'm not settling. Clara met his eyes across the table. What we have is complicated and difficult and probably foolish by most people's standards. But it's real. It's honest. And it's ours. That night, for the first time since Clara had arrived, Elias didn't retreat to his separate room. They sat together by the fire long after the dishes were done, talking and not talking, existing in each other's presence with complete comfort. When Clara finally stood to go to bed, Elias stood with her. Stay, she said quietly. Don't go to your room. Stay with me. Elias searched her face. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything. They lay together that night in Clara's bed, wrapped in each other's arms, and Elias told her about Sarah. Really told her. Not the sanitized version he'd given before, but the whole truth. How he'd loved her desperately. how her death had destroyed him, how he'd blamed himself for years, convinced that if he'd been different, better, more acceptable, maybe she would have survived. "It wasn't your fault," Clara said fiercely, her fingers threading through his hair. "Childbirth kills women every day. Rich women, poor women, women married to the most powerful men in the world. It wasn't about you or what you are. It was just tragedy." "I know that in my head, but my heart," Elias's voice broke. "My heart still thinks I could have saved her somehow." "You couldn't have. And carrying that guilt won't bring her back." Clara pulled back enough to look at him, her weathered face gentle in the moonlight. "But you can let yourself live again. You can let yourself be happy. She would want that for you." "How do you know?" "Because anyone who truly loved you would want you to be happy. And if she didn't, then she didn't deserve your grief." It was the truth, stark and undeniable, and Elias felt something release in his chest. The guilt he'd carried for years didn't disappear. Grief never truly disappeared, but it loosened its stranglehold on his heart. "I love you," he said, the words coming out raw and unpracticed. "I didn't think I could feel this way again, but I do. I love you, Clara." Clara's eyes filled with tears, though her smile was radiant. "I love you too, and I'm not going anywhere. No matter what the world throws at us, I'm staying right here." They made love that night with a tenderness born of deep knowing, not the desperate passion of youth, but something richer and more sustaining, a joining of two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen to build something together despite every obstacle. And when they finally slept, wrapped around each other beneath Clara's quilts, Elias dreamed not of loss, but of possibility, of children running through the ranch, of years stretching ahead filled with work and laughter and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, of a future that was no longer something to endure, but something to embrace. The weeks that followed brought rapid change as spring fully took hold. The snow retreated to the highest peaks. Grass grew green and thick in the pastures. The garden plot that had lain fallow all winter was tilled and planted, Clara working alongside Elias to create neat rows of vegetables that would feed them through the next winter. They worked from dawn to dusk, exhausted every night but satisfied in a way that went beyond physical accomplishment. They were building something together, creating a life that reflected both of them. And slowly, cautiously, their neighbors began to take notice. The first visitor arrived on a mild afternoon in late April. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw the wagon approaching, an older woman with iron gray hair and a no-nonsense expression driving a team of sturdy horses. "Elias," Clara called, "we have company." Elias emerged from the barn, his expression wary, but when he saw who it was, some of the tension left his shoulders. "That's Ann Morrison. She and her husband have the ranch 8 miles east." Ann pulled her wagon to a stop and climbed down with the stiff movements of someone who'd been driving for hours. She looked Clara over with sharp eyes, then nodded once, as if confirming something. "You must be the new Mrs. Crow," she said without preamble. "Heard about the scene in Ridgemont last month. Figured it was time to come see for myself what kind of woman tells off drunk men in the middle of town." Clara felt Elias tense beside her, but she kept her own expression neutral. "That would be me. Though I'd hardly call it a scene, just setting a few things straight." Setting things straight. Anne's lips twitched. Might have been the beginning of a smile. That's one way to put it. Harris has been complaining to anyone who'll listen about the uppity woman who insulted him. Should I apologize? Hell no. Harris is a fool and a drunk. About time someone told him so. Anne's expression turned serious. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because we've been neighbors to Elias for near about 6 years now, and in all that time we've kept our distance. Not because of anything he did wrong, but because it was easier not to get involved." "Get involved in what?" Clara asked quietly. "In the way this town treats people who don't fit their narrow idea of acceptable." Anne's voice was heavy with regret. "My husband and I, we're not like Harris and his ilk. We don't hold with that kind of prejudice. But we're cowards, both of us. We saw how Elias was treated, and we did nothing. We told ourselves it wasn't our business, that getting involved would only make things worse." She turned to Elias then, her weathered face full of shame. "I'm sorry for that. For all the years we should have been better neighbors. Better people. Elias looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. You don't owe me an apology, Anne. You and Jacob have always been civil. Civil isn't the same as decent, and we should have been decent. Anne's jaw tightened. But watching you defend your husband in town, Mrs. Crow, the way you stood up without flinching, it shamed me. Made me realize that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing anyway. Clara felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I appreciate that, Mrs. Morrison, more than you know. Anne, call me Anne. And I hope you'll call on me if you ever need anything. We may be 8 miles apart, but that doesn't mean we can't be friends. She glanced between them, her expression softening. And I hope you'll both come to dinner sometime. Jacob would like to meet you properly, Mrs. Crow. And I think it's time we started treating you both like the neighbors you are. It was a small gesture, a tiny crack in the wall of isolation that had surrounded Elias for years. But it mattered. It mattered more than Clara could articulate. After Anne left, Elias stood in the yard for a long time, staring at the spot where her wagon had been. 6 years, he said finally. 6 years I've lived here, and that's the first time anyone has. He trailed off, unable to finish. Clara came to stand beside him, taking his hand. Things are changing. What we did in Ridgemont, what I did, it forced people to choose, to either keep pretending you're not fully human or to acknowledge that you are. Anne chose right. And the others? Some will choose right. Some won't. But the ones who matter will. She squeezed his hand. We're not going to win everyone over. But we don't need everyone. We just need enough decent people to stand with us. Over the following weeks, more visitors came. Not many, but enough. Tom Brennan, the blacksmith, stopped by to check on some equipment and stayed for coffee, treating them both with gruff respect. A young couple who'd recently homesteaded nearby came to ask advice about building a chicken coop and left with seeds and encouragement. Not everyone was friendly. Some people still crossed the street when they saw Elias in town. Some still whispered behind their hands and made it clear that Clara's loyalty to her husband was incomprehensible to them. But slowly, painfully, a small community was forming around them. People who saw them as they were, hardworking ranchers building a life together, rather than as some kind of scandal or aberration. And Clara realized that this was what victory looked like in places like this. Not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but small acts of decency accumulating over time. One conversation, one shared meal, one moment of treating each other as fully human. It wasn't much, but it was enough. One evening in early May, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Elias turned to Clara with an expression of wonder. I never thought this was possible, he said quietly. Having this. Having you. Having neighbors who see me as more than what I am. You were always more than what you are, Clara corrected gently. Some people just couldn't see it. But you could, from the beginning. Because I wasn't looking at your blood or your heritage. I was looking at you. She leaned against him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders. And what I saw was a man who'd survived everything the world threw at him and kept building anyway. That's worth more than any bloodline. Elias pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the sky turned from blue to purple to black, and the first stars appeared. And Clara thought about that day in Ridgemont, about standing in front of drunk men and defending the person she loved, about making a choice that could have destroyed them, but instead had started to heal them. She'd told Elias the truth that day. He was worth defending, worth fighting for, worth building a life with, no matter what the cost. And as she sat there, wrapped in his arms under the vast Montana sky, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she would make that choice again. Every day. For the rest of her life. Because this complicated, difficult, beautiful thing they'd built together was worth everything. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the fields and turned the work into something that had to be done in the early morning or late evening. But Clara and Elias didn't mind. They'd found a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, working side by side in the cool dawn hours, retreating to the shade during midday, then returning to their tasks as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. The garden flourished under Clara's careful attention. Rows of beans and squash and tomatoes grew thick and healthy, promising a harvest that would see them through the next winter with plenty to spare. The livestock thrived too, the cattle growing fat on summer grass, the chickens laying steadily, even the horses seeming more content than they had in years. But it was more than just the physical prosperity that marked the change. The ranch itself felt different now, less like a fortress against the world, and more like a home where two people were building a life worth protecting. Clara had transformed the house in subtle ways. Curtains now hung at every window, letting in light while providing privacy. Herbs dried from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and lavender. A braided rug covered the floor near the hearth where they spent their evenings. Small touches that said someone cared about more than just survival, that beauty and comfort mattered even in hard country. And Elias had changed too. He smiled more easily now, laughed at Clara's dry observations, touched her freely throughout the day, a hand on her shoulder as he passed, fingers brushing hers when they worked together, kisses stolen in the barn when no one was watching. The walls he'd built around himself had crumbled, and what emerged was a man capable of joy despite everything the world had thrown at him. They made plans, real plans that extended beyond the next season or the next storm. Plans for expanding the herd, for building a proper root cellar, for adding another room to the house. Plans that assumed a future together, that took for granted they would be here, doing this work year after year. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies drift across the darkening pasture, Clara spoke the thought that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "I want to make this official." Elias turned to look at her, his expression curious. "Official how?" "Married. Properly married. Not just telling people we are, but actually doing it." Clara's voice was steady, though her heart was beating faster. "I know we said this was a partnership, a practical arrangement, and it is, but it's also more than that now. And I want the world to know it." Elias was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "You're sure? Once we do that, there's no taking it back. You'll be legally bound to a half-breed rancher in the middle of nowhere. No escape if you change your mind." "I'm not going to change my mind." Clara took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I love you, Elias. I want to be your wife in every sense of the word. I want my name to be yours. I want whatever children we might have to be legitimate in the eyes of the law. I want all of it." Something fierce and tender crossed Elias's face. "Children?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but didn't look away. "If we're blessed with them, yes. I know I'm not young anymore. I know it might not happen. But if it does—" She paused, gathering courage. "I want to build a family with you, a real family, the kind neither of us had growing up." Elias pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. She could feel him trembling slightly, could hear the roughness in his voice when he finally spoke. "I want that too. More than I knew I could want anything." He pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "When Sarah died, I thought that dream died with her. Thought I'd lost my only chance at having a family. But you've given me hope again. You've given me everything." They sat together in the gathering darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, and made plans for a wedding. Nothing fancy, nothing that required the approval of people who wouldn't give it anyway. Just a simple ceremony with Anne and Jacob Morrison as witnesses, officiated by the circuit judge who passed through Ridgemont twice a year. But first, they had work to do. The next morning, they began transforming the ranch in earnest. Elias started construction on an addition to the house, a proper nursery that could also serve as a guest room, built with the same careful attention to detail he brought to everything. Clara planted flowers around the foundation, creating splashes of color that softened the stark lines of the buildings. "You two have been running that ranch like a proper married couple since winter. Might as well have the paperwork to match." Not everyone was supportive. Harris and his friends made a point of loudly discussing the impropriety of white women marrying beneath themselves whenever Clara was in earshot. A few people at the boarding house refused to acknowledge her presence. The owner of the saloon made it clear that Elias was still unwelcome in his establishment, but the kindnesses outweighed the cruelties, and that made all the difference. The judge arrived in Ridgemont on the first Tuesday in July, a pragmatic man in his 60s who'd seen enough of frontier life to be unsurprised by anything. He met with Clara and Elias at the Morrison Ranch, where Anne had insisted the ceremony take place. "You understand what you're doing?" the judge asked Clara bluntly. "Marrying Mr. Crow will affect your legal status, your social standing, possibly your safety. I need to know you're entering into this freely." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I understand completely, and I'm entering into this not just freely, but eagerly. Elias Crow is the finest man I've ever known. I count myself fortunate to marry him." The judge nodded, seemingly satisfied. "And you, Mr. Crow? You understand that marriage creates certain legal obligations, certain responsibilities." "I do," Elias said quietly, "and I'm ready for them. Have been ready since the day Clara agreed to come here." The ceremony itself was brief and straightforward. They stood in the Morrisons' parlor with Anne and Jacob as witnesses, sunlight streaming through the windows, and spoke their vows with a solemnity that needed no elaborate decoration. When the judge pronounced them legally married, when Elias kissed Clara with gentle reverence, Anne wept openly, and even Jacob had to clear his throat several times. "You're good people," Jacob said afterward, shaking Elias's hand with genuine warmth. "Both of you. And anyone who says different can answer to me." They returned to their ranch that evening as husband and wife, the legal paperwork safely tucked away, their names joined on an official document that no one could dispute. It should have felt different, Clara thought. But it didn't. They'd been married in all the ways that mattered long before the judge said the words. What did change was the confidence with which they moved through the world. There was no more pretending, no more careful lies about winter weddings. They were married. Legally, publicly, irrevocably married. And that simple fact carried weight. Over the following weeks, Clara noticed subtle shifts in how they were treated. The boarding house owner's wife nodded to her in passing. A young couple who'd just arrived in the territory asked Elias for advice on building their homestead. Marcus Webb started setting aside items he thought Clara might need, saving her the trouble of asking. The community was adjusting, slowly learning to see them as just another married couple trying to make a life in hard country. It wasn't universal acceptance. Nothing ever would be. But it was progress. And then, on a warm August morning, Clara woke feeling different. She lay still for a moment, trying to identify the sensation. Not sick, exactly, but off somehow. A heaviness in her body, a sensitivity to smells, a bone-deep weariness that sleep hadn't touched. She'd felt this way before, years ago, during her brief pregnancy with Robert, the baby she'd lost at 3 months, the child that had never been and had driven the final wedge between her and her late husband. Clara's hand moved to her stomach, pressing gently against the flat plane beneath her nightdress. Could it be? Was it possible? She didn't say anything to Elias that morning, didn't want to raise hopes that might be dashed. But as the days passed and the signs continued, the morning queasiness, the exhaustion, the tenderness in her breasts, she became more certain. Finally, after 2 weeks of silent observation, she told him. They were sitting at the table after dinner, the remains of their meal pushed aside, lamplight casting soft shadows on the walls. Clara had been trying to find the right words all evening, but in the end, she just said it plainly. "I think I'm with child." Elias went completely still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "You think?" "I'm fairly certain. All the signs are there. But it's early yet. Too early to know for sure." Clara watched his face carefully, trying to read his reaction. "I know we talked about this possibility, but if you're not ready, not ready." Elias set down his cup with shaking hands. "Clara, Are you all right? Are you feeling well? Do you need anything?" "I'm fine, just tired. And a little sick in the mornings. But that's normal." She reached across the table to take his hand. "Are you happy about this?" "Happy?" Elias's voice cracked. "I'm terrified and thrilled. And, Clara, I lost Sarah this way. Lost the baby. The thought of going through that again, of losing you. You won't lose me." Clara gripped his hand tighter, willing him to believe her. "I'm stronger than Sarah was. Older, yes, but also healthier. I've done hard physical work my whole life. My body is made for this." "You can't know that." "No, I can't. But I refuse to spend the next 7 months living in fear." Clara's voice was firm. "This baby is a gift, a chance for both of us to build the family we always wanted. and I'm choosing to be grateful for it rather than afraid." Elias looked at her with an expression so full of love and fear and hope that it made Clara's chest ache. Then he stood, came around the table, and knelt beside her chair, pressing his face against her stomach. "Please," he whispered, so quietly Clara almost didn't hear. "Please let them both be all right." She ran her fingers through his hair, feeling him tremble against her. "We'll be all right, all of us. I promise." It was a promise she had no right to make, no way to guarantee. Childbirth killed women every day, even women younger and healthier than Clara. But she made it anyway because Elias needed to hear it, and because she needed to believe it herself. The pregnancy progressed through late summer and into fall, and Clara continued to work despite Elias's protests. She refused to be treated as fragile, insisted on maintaining her share of the labor, only conceding to slightly lighter loads and more frequent rest periods. "I'm growing a baby, not dying," she told Elias when he tried to take over all her chores. "Women have been doing this while working for thousands of years. I'll be fine." But she did make concessions. She let Elias handle all the heavy lifting. She napped in the afternoons when the exhaustion became overwhelming. She ate more than she wanted, knowing the baby needed nourishment even when food made her queasy. And slowly, as the weeks passed without complications, Elias began to relax. He started talking to her stomach, telling the unborn child about the ranch, about the mountains, about the life they would have together. He built a cradle from smooth pine wood, carved with the same creak patterns he'd put on Clara's rocking chair. He transformed the new room into a proper nursery, painting the walls and building shelves, and making everything perfect. Clara watched him work with a fullness in her heart that had nothing to do with the child growing in her womb. This man, this beautiful, broken, healing man, was going to be a father, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would be extraordinary at it. Anne Morrison visited regularly, bringing advice and supplies and her own brand of no-nonsense comfort. "You're doing fine," she declared after examining Clara with the practiced eye of a woman who'd helped deliver half the babies in the territory. "Baby's growing well, you're healthy, everything's as it should be, just keep doing what you're doing." Other women started visiting too, drawn by the universal female experience of pregnancy and childbirth. Women who'd kept their distance before now came to offer congratulations, to share their own stories, to welcome Clara into the unofficial sisterhood of frontier mothers. Even some of the hostile looks in town softened. A pregnant woman was harder to demonize than an abstract scandal. Children were valued in this harsh country, necessary for survival and continuation. And watching Clara walk through Ridgemont with her growing belly and her head held high, Elias's hand protectively at her back seemed to shift something in people's perceptions. They were no longer just the half-breed rancher and his unlikely wife. They were becoming a family, and that meant something, even to people who'd initially disapproved. As autumn painted the mountains gold and red, Clara's body changed in ways both uncomfortable and miraculous. Her stomach swelled, first slightly, then dramatically. The baby began to move, first flutters that might have been imagination, then definite kicks and rolls that made both her and Elias laugh with wonder. "Strong," Elias said one evening, his hand spread across Clara's stomach as the baby tumbled inside her. "Already so strong." "Takes after both of us," Clara replied, wincing as a particularly vigorous kick caught her under the ribs. "Stubborn too, I'd wager." They talked about names late into the night, names from both their heritages, trying to find something that honored where they came from while acknowledging who they were becoming. It was harder than Clara expected, fraught with all the weight of identity and belonging and the world their child would inherit. "Whatever we choose," Elias said finally, "I want them to be proud of who they are. All of who they are, not hiding any piece of themselves to make other people comfortable." "They won't have to hide," Clara promised, "because we're going to raise them to be strong enough that hiding never occurs to them." As the first snow began to fall in November, Clara's time grew near. Anne came to stay at the ranch for the final weeks, her experience and calm presence a comfort to them both. She set up a birthing room, assembled supplies, and walked Clara through what to expect with practical directness. "It's going to hurt," Anne said bluntly. "Anyone who tells you different is lying. But you're strong, and your body knows what to do. Trust it. Trust yourself." Elias was terrified. Clara could see it in the tension he carried in his shoulders, in the way he watched her constantly, as if she might disappear if he looked away. She understood his fear, couldn't entirely dismiss it, but refused to let it infect her own outlook. "I'm going to be fine," she told him one evening as they lay in bed together, her enormous stomach a barrier between them. "You have to believe that." "I'm trying." "Try harder." Clara took his hand and placed it on her belly, letting him feel the baby's movements. "This child needs both of us, which means I have to survive this, which means I will. Do you understand?" Elias nodded, though his eyes were still dark with worry. "I love you, both of you. So much it terrifies me." "Love should terrify you. Means it's real." The baby came on a cold December night, 3 days before the winter solstice. Clara woke to contractions that started mild but quickly intensified. She lay still for a moment, breathing through the pain, then reached over to wake Elias. "It's time." He was up instantly, moving with controlled urgency to wake Anne and prepare the room. Clara walked through the early contractions, pacing the house while her body did its ancient work. This part wasn't so bad. Uncomfortable, but manageable. Then the contraction strengthened, and manageable became difficult. Difficult became excruciating. The world narrowed to cycles of pain and brief respite, each wave cresting higher than the last. Anne coached her through it with steady competence. "That's good. Breathe through it. Don't fight the pain. Work with it. Your body knows what to do." Elias stayed nearby, his face white but his hands steady, offering water and cool cloths in his presence. Clara gripped his hand during the worst contractions, squeezing hard enough to hurt, drawing strength from his solid warmth. Hours passed. The pain became a constant thing, overwhelming and all-consuming. Clara heard herself making sounds she didn't recognize, animal sounds of effort and agony. She lost track of time, of everything except the imperative to push, to work, to bring this child into the world. "I can see the head," Anne said, her voice sharp with excitement. "Clara, listen to me. Next contraction, you push as hard as you can. Understand?" Clara nodded, gathering her strength. The contraction came, and she bore down with everything she had, feeling something shift and give. "Again! One more!" Another push, another wave of pain so intense she thought she might break apart. Then suddenly, miraculous relief as the baby slipped free into Anne's waiting hands. For one terrible moment there was silence. Then a cry split the air, strong and furious and alive. "It's a girl," Anne announced, her voice thick with emotion. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Clara collapsed back against the pillows, shaking with exhaustion and relief. Elias was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as Anne cleaned the baby and wrapped her in soft blankets. "Here," Anne said, placing the tiny bundle in Clara's arms. "Meet your daughter." Clara looked down at the squirming infant and felt her heart crack open. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be brown like her father's. Her skin was somewhere between Clara's paleness and Elias's deeper tone, a beautiful blend that spoke of both heritages. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "We've been waiting for you." Elias knelt beside the bed, one hand gently touching the baby's tiny head. "She's perfect." "She is," Anne agreed, beginning to clean up with efficient movements. "And you did beautifully, Clara. I've seen births go much worse. You were made for this." Over the next hour, Anne helped Clara deliver the afterbirth and cleaned her up while Elias held his daughter with trembling hands, talking to her in a low voice that mixed English with words from his mother's language. Clara watched through heavy-lidded eyes, exhausted but content, her body aching but her heart full. When Anne finally left them alone, declaring she'd check on them in a few hours, but they needed rest first, Clara and Elias lay together in bed with their daughter between them, neither able to stop touching her, marveling at her tiny perfection. "What should we name her?" Elias asked softly. Clara had thought about this through all the long months of pregnancy, had gone through countless names from both their backgrounds. But now, looking at their daughter's peaceful, sleeping face, one name rose above all the others. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope, because that's what she is, what she represents. Hope for the future, hope that the world can change, hope that love can overcome anything." Elias's eyes filled with fresh tears. Hope, he repeated. Hope Crow. It's perfect. They stayed awake most of that night, too full of wonder to sleep, taking turns holding Hope and staring at her with the awe of new parents. Every tiny sound she made, every small movement, felt like a miracle. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, Clara looked at Elias holding their daughter and felt a peace she'd never known before. They'd built this. Against all odds, against a world that told them they shouldn't exist, they'd created a family. Thank you, Elias said quietly, his eyes still on Hope's tiny face. For what? For coming here. For staying. For believing in me when no one else did. For giving me this. He gestured at Hope, at the room around them, at the life they'd built together. For giving me everything. Clara reached out and took his free hand, their fingers intertwining just as they had that day in the wagon months ago. You gave me everything too, a home, a purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning. Love. She paused, then added quietly, a family. They sat together as the sun rose higher, three people who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen to build something that would outlast them both. And in that moment, in that perfect stillness, Clara knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be challenges, there always were, they would face them together. The land had tested them. The world had tried to break them, but they'd survived. More than survived. They'd thrived. And now they had hope, their daughter, their future, their legacy. The proof that love, real love, could overcome anything. The weeks following Hope's birth transformed the ranch into something none of them had anticipated. The quiet house that had once echoed with silence now filled with the sounds of infant life, crying and cooing, and the soft shuffle of parents who moved through exhaustion like swimmers pushing through deep water. Clara recovered slowly from the birth, her body aching in ways she'd forgotten were possible. But every time she looked at Hope nursing at her breast or sleeping peacefully in the cradle Elias had built, the discomfort faded into insignificance. This was what she'd been missing all those years with Robert. Not just a child, but the right partner to raise one with. Elias was a revelation as a father. Clara had expected him to be good, patient, and protective, but she hadn't anticipated the depth of his devotion. He woke at the slightest sound from Hope, changed her with gentle efficiency, walked the floor with her for hours when she was fussy. He sang to her in his mother's language, low melodies that seemed to calm her instantly. And the way he looked at his daughter with wonder and fierce love and almost religious gratitude made Clara fall in love with him all over again. You're going to spoil her, Clara observed one evening, watching Elias rock Hope long after she'd fallen asleep. Impossible to spoil something this perfect, he replied without looking up. She's already got you wrapped around her tiny finger. Good. That's exactly where I want to be. Winter settled around them with its usual harshness, but this year it felt different. The isolation that had once been oppressive now felt protective, cocooning their small family in a world where nothing existed except their work and their love and the tiny life they were nurturing together. Anne Morrison visited regularly, making the treacherous journey despite the snow to check on both Clara and Hope. She's thriving, Anne declared during one such visit, examining Hope with practiced hands. Strong and healthy, you're doing everything right. It doesn't feel like it, Clara admitted. Half the time I have no idea what I'm doing. That's how all mothers feel. The ones who think they know everything are the dangerous ones. Anne handed Hope back to Clara with a smile. You're listening to your instincts, and that's the most important thing. But as the weeks turned into months and Hope grew from helpless newborn into an alert, active infant, Clara began to feel the stirrings of restlessness. She loved her daughter desperately, would die for her without hesitation. But the constant demands of motherhood, the endless cycle of feeding and changing and soothing, left little room for the woman she'd been before. She missed the work, missed the satisfaction of physical labor, of accomplishing tasks, of being more than just a source of milk and comfort. One morning in late February, when Hope was nearly 3 months old, Clara bundled the baby warmly and carried her out to the barn where Elias was working. I want to help, she said without preamble. Elias looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression carefully neutral. You are helping. You're taking care of Hope. I know, but I need to do more than that. I need to feel useful in other ways. Clara shifted Hope in her arms, the baby making small, contented sounds. I can work with her strapped to me. Women have been doing it forever. Please, Elias, I'm going stir-crazy inside that house. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but nothing too strenuous. And the moment you or Hope need to go inside, you go. No arguments. No arguments, Clara agreed, relief flooding through her. So they fashioned a sling that allowed Clara to carry Hope against her chest, while her hands remained free for lighter work. It wasn't perfect. The baby still needed to nurse frequently, still demanded attention at unpredictable intervals, but it allowed Clara to feel like herself again, like a full partner rather than just a mother. The arrangement worked better than either of them expected. Hope seemed to enjoy being outside, watching the world with bright, curious eyes. And having both parents present throughout the day created a different kind of rhythm, one where work and family wove together seamlessly. As spring approached, they began making plans for expansion. The ranch was doing well, better than it ever had when Elias worked it alone. They had enough saved to add more cattle, to clear additional land for crops, to truly build something substantial. I want to hire help, Elias said one evening as they reviewed their finances. Someone to help with the heavy work so you don't have to push yourself so hard. Clara looked up from nursing Hope. Can we afford it? Barely, but I think it's worth it. We're not just surviving anymore. We're building something for Hope, something that will outlast us both. He paused, his expression turning serious. And I want to make it official. Put the ranch in both our names. Make sure if anything happens to me, you and Hope are protected. Nothing's going to happen to you. You can't know that. Accidents happen. Illness happens. I need to know my family is taken care of. The word family still had the power to move Clara deeply. Family. Not just two people coexisting, but something larger and more permanent, something worth protecting with legal documents and careful planning. All right, she agreed. We'll do it properly. Both our names on everything. They made the trip to Ridgemont in early April, Hope bundled against Clara's chest, to register the changes with the land office. The clerk who handled their paperwork was new, a young man who processed the request without comment or judgment, treating them like any other married couple conducting business. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary transaction. But for Clara and Elias, it represented something profound. They were legitimate now in every possible way, legal partners in property and parenthood, a family recognized by law and community alike. As they walked back to the wagon, Hope sleeping peacefully against Clara's chest, they encountered Marcus Webb outside his store. Mr. and Mrs. Crow, he greeted them with a nod. And the little one, she's getting big. Growing every day, Clara replied, surprised by the warmth in his voice. I'm glad to see it. Glad to see all of you thriving. Marcus hesitated, then added quietly, I know I wasn't always as welcoming as I should have been. Want you to know that's changed. You're good people, good for this community. It was as close to an apology as they were likely to get, and Clara accepted it graciously. Thank you, Mr. Webb. That means more than you know. They were loading supplies into the wagon when trouble found them one last time. Harris appeared from the direction of the saloon, his face flushed with drink and something uglier. Two of his usual companions flanked him, but they looked less certain than Harris, less committed to whatever confrontation he had planned. Well, well, Harris slurred, positioning himself between the wagon and Elias. The happy family. How touching. Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. We're not looking for trouble, Harris. Just loading up and heading home. Of course you're not looking for trouble. You never are you? Just keep your head down, stay quiet, hope everyone forgets what you are. Harris's eyes slid to Clara and Hope. How's it feel, Mrs. Crow? Knowing your daughter's a half-breed? Knowing she'll never be accepted by decent folk? The words hit like a physical blow, but Clara's response was ice-cold fury rather than pain. She handed Hope to Elias, making sure the baby was secure in his arms, then turned to face Harris with an expression that made him take an involuntary step back. My daughter, she said, her voice low and deadly, is beautiful and perfect and worth 100 of you. She's going to grow up knowing she comes from two strong people who built something real in this wilderness. She's going to know her heritage, all of it, is something to be proud of, not ashamed of. You think you're so much better than everyone else, Harris spat. You and your Indian-loving ways. You've shamed your whole race. My race? Clara laughed, sharp and bitter. You mean the race that includes drunks like you? The race that thinks cruelty makes you strong and prejudice makes you righteous? If that's what I'm shaming, then I'm proud to do it. She stepped closer, close enough that Harris had to look down to meet her eyes, close enough that he could smell the courage and conviction radiating from her. My husband is twice the man you'll ever be. My daughter is going to grow up knowing that worth isn't measured by the color of someone's skin or the purity of their bloodline. She's going to grow up strong and proud and completely uninterested in the opinions of small, bitter men like you. Clara's voice rose now, loud enough that people were stopping to listen, drawn by the confrontation. And you know what the real shame is, Harris? It's not that I married a man with Creek blood. It's that we live in a world where that's supposed to matter. It's that we've built a society where people like you get to decide who's worthy and who isn't. It's that kindness and courage and honor matter less than whether someone fits your narrow definition of acceptable. She paused, letting the silence stretch, then delivered her final blow. But the world is changing, faster than you realize. And people like you, people who measure worth by bloodline and skin tone, are going to be left behind. My daughter is the future. She's proof that love is stronger than hate, and there's nothing you or anyone like you can do to change that. The crowd that had gathered was silent. Some faces showed shock, others approval, still others confusion. But Harris's face showed only impotent rage. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and stalked away, his companions following with uncertain glances back. Clara stood there for a moment, shaking with adrenaline, then turned to find Elias watching her with an expression of absolute wonder. That was, he started, then stopped, unable to find words. Necessary, Clara finished. She took Hope back from him, cradling the baby against her chest. I'm tired of staying quiet, tired of pretending that prejudice is something we have to accept. If we don't fight it, how will Hope ever learn to? Elias pulled her close, wrapping both wife and daughter in his arms. I love you, he said fiercely, more than I have words for. I love you too, both of you. Clara looked around at the dispersing crowd, at the mixture of reactions on their faces. Let's go home. They left Ridgemont behind and headed back up into the mountains, back to their ranch and the life they'd built there. And as the town disappeared behind them, Clara felt something settle in her chest. A certainty. A peace. They were never going to win everyone over. Some people would always see them as wrong, improper, a violation of natural order. But they didn't need everyone. They just needed each other. And the handful of decent people who were willing to see past prejudice to the truth underneath. That was enough. That would always be enough. The months that followed brought changes both gradual and profound. They hired help as planned, a young man named Daniel who'd recently arrived in the territory and needed work. He was quiet and hardworking, and if he had any opinions about working for a mixed-race family, he kept them to himself. With Daniel handling the heaviest labor, Clara and Elias were able to focus on the more skilled work, training horses, improving breeding stock, expanding their crops. The ranch prospered in ways that went beyond mere financial success. It became known as a place where good work was valued, where people were judged by their character rather than their bloodline. Hope grew from infant into toddler, her personality emerging like spring flowers pushing through snow. She was fearless and curious, equally comfortable in the barn or the garden, fascinated by animals and weather and the endless wonders of the natural world. She had her father's eyes and her mother's determination, and watching her explore the ranch with complete confidence in her right to be there filled both Clara and Elias with fierce pride. She doesn't know yet, Clara observed one evening, watching Hope chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Doesn't know that the world thinks she's supposed to be ashamed of what she is. Maybe she never has to know, Elias said quietly. She'll know. Eventually. Someone will make sure she knows. Clara's voice was sad but resolute. But by the time she learns it, she'll be strong enough that it won't break her. We're making sure of that. And they were. Every day, in 100 small ways, they were building Hope's foundation, teaching her that she came from two proud traditions, that both were valuable, that she was whole and complete exactly as she was. Elias taught her words in his mother's language, told her stories about the Creek people and their ways. Clara taught her to read and write, to cook and garden, to handle practical tasks with competence. Together they showed her what a marriage based on mutual respect looked like, what partnership meant, what love could accomplish when it refused to bend to the world's expectations. As Hope's second birthday approached, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. The news was both joyful and terrifying. The first pregnancy had gone well, but there were no guarantees, and Clara was older now, more worn by the harsh frontier life. But when she told Elias, his reaction was pure happiness. "Another one?" he breathed, his hand already moving to her still flat stomach. "We're going to have another baby. Are you ready for this? 2 children is going to be harder than 1. I'm ready for anything, as long as we face it together." This pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways, harder in others. Clara knew what to expect now, knew how to pace herself, knew that the exhaustion and nausea would pass. But she was also chasing after an active toddler while growing another human, and the combination left her perpetually tired. Elias compensated by taking over more of Hope's care, spending long hours with his daughter while Clara rested. Daniel stepped up too, handling tasks that would have normally fallen to Clara. And the community, that small circle of decent people who'd learned to see past prejudice, rallied around them. Anne visited frequently with supplies and advice. Other women stopped by with offers of help. Even Marcus Webb sent word that he'd set aside special items for the new baby. The world hadn't changed completely. There were still people who crossed the street to avoid them, still whispers and judgment. But the circle of acceptance had grown large enough that the Crow family existed within it comfortably. The baby came in early autumn, another daughter they named Grace, because Grace was what they'd been given, undeserved and precious. The birth was easier than Hope's had been, faster and less frightening. And when it was over, Clara held her new daughter and felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. Elias sat beside the bed with Hope on his lap, both of them staring at the new baby with matching expressions of wonder. "She looks like you," Hope declared, reaching out to touch Grace's tiny hand. "She looks like all of us," Elias corrected gently. "She's ours, part of our family." Hope considered this solemnly, then nodded. "I'll teach her everything. How to feed the chickens, and find eggs, and talk to the horses." Clara laughed, exhausted but happy. "Not right away. She needs to grow a little first." But Hope was already making plans, already embracing her role as big sister with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else. The years that followed were full ones. Hard work and small triumphs, setbacks and successes. The ranch continued to grow, establishing a reputation for quality livestock and fair dealing. Daniel eventually moved on to start his own homestead, replaced by others who came and went over the seasons. Hope and Grace grew up strong and confident, knowing their place in the world even when the world tried to tell them they didn't have one. Hope became the image of her father, dark and watchful and deeply connected to the land. Grace took after Clara, practical and determined and unafraid to speak her mind. Together, they were a force of nature, defending each other against any slight, real or imagined. The few times other children tried to bully them about their heritage, the sisters handled it with a combination of words and, when necessary, action that made Clara simultaneously proud and concerned. "They need to learn to turn the other cheek," she said to Elias, after Hope bloodied another child's nose for calling Grace a half-breed. "Why?" Elias asked. "So they can be victims? So they can learn to accept injustice quietly?" He shook his head. "I spent years turning the other cheek. It doesn't stop the hatred. It just teaches bullies that they can get away with it." "But violence isn't the answer, I know. But neither is submission." He looked at Clara seriously. "Our daughters need to know they're worth defending, that they don't have to accept cruelty just because it's directed at them. Hope was defending her sister. I can't punish her for that." Clara sighed, knowing he was right, even as she worried about the consequences. But as the girls grew older and the incidents became less frequent, she realized that their strength was protecting them. People learned not to cross the Crow daughters. Not because they were afraid of retaliation, but because the girls carried themselves with such absolute confidence that prejudice seemed to slide off them like water off stone. When Hope turned 16, a young man from town began courting her, the son of Tom Brennan, the blacksmith who'd been one of the first to treat Elias with genuine respect. The boy, James, was clearly smitten, and Hope seemed to return his interest. "What do you think?" Clara asked Elias one evening, watching the young couple talk on the porch. "I think she's got good taste. James is a decent kid, hard-working, respectful. And his parents? Are they going to accept this?" "Tom already has. Told me last week he'd be proud to have Hope as a daughter-in-law, if it comes to that." Elias smiled slightly. "Times are changing, Clara. Slowly, but they are." And they were. The frontier was filling up with new people, new ideas, new ways of thinking. The old prejudices were still there, but they were being challenged more frequently. And families like the Crows, mixed heritage, successful, respected, were living proof that the old hierarchies didn't have to define the future. When winter came that year, fiercer than any they'd experienced since Hope's birth, the Crow family faced it together with the confidence of people who'd survived worse. They'd stockpiled supplies, reinforced their buildings, prepared for months of isolation. But they weren't isolated. Anne and Jacob Morrison rode out several times to check on them. Other neighbors stopped by when the weather permitted. Even Marcus Webb sent word asking if they needed anything, offering credit if supplies ran low. The community had finally become what it should have been all along, a network of people supporting each other through hardship, regardless of bloodline or heritage. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside and the family gathered around the fire, Hope and Grace playing a game while their parents watched, Elias turned to Clara with an expression of contentment. "You remember that first winter?" he asked quietly. "When you'd just arrived and we weren't sure we'd make it through?" "I remember thinking the silence would drive me mad," Clara replied. "Now I couldn't imagine life without it." "That's not what I meant." Elias took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "I meant I remember thinking that if we survived the winter, maybe we had a chance. Maybe this partnership could actually work. And now? Now I know it's more than survival, more than partnership. This is everything I never knew I needed." He gestured at their daughters, at the warm house, at the life they'd built together. "This is what Sarah and I were trying to create, but we never could have. Because it takes more than love to build something like this. It takes strength, stubbornness, the willingness to face down a world that says you shouldn't exist and build something anyway." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "We did build something, didn't we?" "We built everything." Elias pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And no storm is ever going to break it." Grace looked up from her game. "Papa, are you being romantic again?" Hope laughed. "He's always romantic with Mama, haven't you noticed?" "It's embarrassing," Grace declared, but she was smiling. Clara laughed too, the sound filling the warm house, and thought about how far they'd come. From that first uncertain wagon ride to this, a family, whole and complete and utterly secure in what they'd created together. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and celebrations and small triumphs. Hope eventually married James Brennan in a ceremony that brought together people from across the territory, proving that acceptance could grow when given time and example. Grace followed her own path, becoming a teacher who educated children regardless of their background or heritage. Clara and Elias grew older together, their bodies wearing down from hard work, but their spirits remaining strong. They added grandchildren to their legacy, little ones who carried forward the mixed heritage that had once been considered shameful and was now simply part of who they were. The ranch prospered through good years and survived the bad ones, becoming a landmark in the territory. The place where Elias Crow had built something from nothing, where love had proven stronger than prejudice, where a family had refused to disappear. And when Clara was old and gray, sitting in the rocking chair Elias had made her so many years ago, watching her grandchildren play in the yard while Elias worked beside them with patient guidance, she thought about that letter she'd written in response to his advertisement. She'd asked for a partnership based on mutual respect and shared labor. She'd wanted honesty and practical arrangement. She'd been so careful not to promise love or romance or anything beyond survival. But what they'd built was so much more than that. They'd created a family that defied every expectation. They'd proven that love could overcome anything when it was backed by courage and determination. They'd changed their small corner of the world, one conversation and one relationship at a time. They'd survived everything the wilderness could throw at them: blizzards and prejudice, loss and pain, the thousand small cruelties of a world that didn't want them to exist. And in surviving, they'd done more than merely endure. They'd thrived. They'd built something beautiful and lasting and true. On a crisp autumn evening, with the mountains painted gold by the setting sun and the first frost glittering on the grass, Elias came to sit beside Clara on the porch. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes still held the same fierce love they'd shown that first winter. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, taking her hand. "Everything. Nothing. How lucky we are." "Lucky," Elias smiled. "I think it was more than luck." "What would you call it? Choice? We chose each other. We chose to stay. We chose to build this life, even when everyone told us we shouldn't." He looked out at the ranch, at the family they'd created, at the legacy they were leaving behind. "Every day we chose each other. That's not luck. That's love." Clara squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that remained despite the years. "Best choice I ever made." "Same." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the stars began to emerge. 3 generations of their family moved through the house and yard, living the life that Clara and Elias had fought so hard to build. The life that had seemed impossible that first winter, but had become more real and solid than anything either of them had known before. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of winter. But Clara wasn't afraid of the cold anymore. Wasn't afraid of the isolation or the hardship or the judgment of people who couldn't understand what they'd created. She had everything she needed right here. A husband who loved her without reservation. Children and grandchildren who carried forward the best of both their heritages. A home that had withstood every storm. A legacy that would outlast them both. This was what they'd built in the wilderness. Not just a ranch or a family, but proof that love could overcome anything. That courage and determination could change the world, one small corner at a time. As the first stars appeared overhead, Clara looked up at the vast Montana sky and felt at peace. They'd done it. Against all odds, against every obstacle, they'd built a life no storm could ever break. And that, she thought, as Elias's arm came around her shoulders and she leaned into his familiar warmth, was everything. That was enough. That was forever.